Hey class. Time for the next round of American art. So our last two times together, we were looking at kind of two strong tendencies: the Ashcan School and that sort of realism, social realism, and the Stieglitz Circle, and that kind of sort of early modernism abstraction. And I made those fairly distinct. I think in practice that might be a little overstated. Those artists knew each other, often got along well, but still had two pretty powerfully different aesthetic starting points and philosophies. So the sort of early maturity of those two groups is sort of the 1900s, 1910s into the 20s, though most of those artists go on to make significant work well into the 1950s and even 60s. So where we want to go next is a group that is actually also kind of starting out in the 1900s and teens, and does their significant work in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, although some of these people also make great work into the 50s and 60s, a couple of them even into the 1970s. Um, so where I want to go next is hard to give a unifying title to. So let's just loosely think of it as American art in the 1920s. And then within it, there are multiple little movements. And I want to just comment on that fact because what we start to find happening in the 20th century, this is true in Europe and certainly true in America, is we start to find multiple little offshoots or branches of styles and of ideas going on. Um, Earlier centuries have a little bit more of a central mainstream style, but as we get into modernism, we start to get multiple branches. That reflects the complexity of modern culture, the sort of diversifying of society and multiple ideas and thoughts happening. And in America, it probably reflects something of the diversity of a democratic outlook as well. So we're kind of weighed in. We're going to go artist by artist, but sometimes they will cohere into smaller groups. Sometimes they're a little bit more just independent artists. Um, so let's begin with the work you're looking at, a painting by Jacob Lawrence. We're going to look at two African American artists here, Jacob Lawrence and Romer Bearden or Romary Bearden. Um, these are artists who emerged out of what's sometimes called the Harlem Renaissance. It's a movement in the teens and 20s occurring in Harlem. By the early 20th century, Harlem has become largely an African American neighborhood and sort of the center place of black culture, and is actually in a remarkably creative place. And so this term, the Harlem Renaissance, is actually a nice term, and it suggests to us there's going to be a lot of creativity. Harlem Renaissance is not limited to visual arts. In fact, the music scene is maybe the most important scene. The poetry scene, the literature scene, these are all really big things going on, but certainly the painting scene. Now, Lawrence and Bearden are sort of half generation older, or I'm sorry, younger than the people who really found the Harlem Renaissance, but they certainly are coming out of the energy of what's going on there. So let's turn to Lawrence. So Lawrence is interesting in terms of subject matter, content. He's very much exploring black experience. He's exploring the ghetto neighborhoods, often the poverty. And in fact, here in Interior Scene, you see him depicting for us the interior of a tenement neighborhood apartment. And there are actually some not so happy things going on in there. There's a woman on a bed shooting up with heroin in her leg. There's rats and cockroaches all about. It's a fairly rundown kind of setting, and this is the neighborhood. Uh, and Lawrence explores these kinds of things. He's exploring black experience, and he does it very, very widely and profoundly. And you'll see that as we go. So you could say, on one level, this is kind of social realism in terms of intent. However, stylistically, it's not. He's really more influenced by that kind of early modernism. It's embracing a simplified abstract style, flattening things, distorting forms to make them highly expressive. And that's a kind of hybrid of content and style. It's not unique to him. Bearden will do a similar thing. So, point being, Lawrence has actually tapped into a lot. He's a really deep and broad thinker, visual thinker. Um, let's follow him a little bit further. Here another work. This one, The Migration of the Negro, #1. This is from a series of 53 small paintings he did. These are all on hardboard, which is a kind of compressed cardboard, and they're in gouache, which is a thick watercolor. These are partly materials he could afford, but they also help him work quickly. And it's important to know that he does a lot of series where he takes a theme or an event and expands on it and explores it widely. The Migration series is a series in which of what was happening in American culture, where many Southern blacks who found that they had little opportunity, who saw the increase of Jim Crow laws, which was basically the white culture's way of re-enslaving African Americans and heading them off from opportunity, from education, from the vote, imprisoning many on trumped up or minimal charges, creating a workforce in prisons that was the tantamount to slave labor. Jim Crow was absolutely brutal, permeated the South. So increasingly, a large number of African Americans migrated to the north, from eastern seaboard through St. Louis and Chicago, Denver, and so on. That part of the culture was more developing in terms of industry, manufacturing, and there were reported to be jobs there, and there were jobs. So many people went up there. What they encountered there was certainly not heaven. There's a strong amount of racism in the North as well, although it tended to be expressed differently. Um, this was a powerful event that happened in American culture, and Lawrence documents it. So here you see this crowd of people sweeping from the right to the left, going to the train stations, buying their tickets for St. Louis, New York, Chicago. Now, this kind of simplifying, abstract patterning, Lawrence is aware of Cubism and other Fauvism and other movements in Europe, and he's using those ideas but developing them in his own way. And there's always in him a kind of a simplicity, a rhythm, and it's very possible that that's somewhat influenced by actually the sounds and rhythms of music that African Americans were creating in these cities, because it's also out of this culture that we get the blues and jazz, and you'll see that with Bearden as well. Here another panel number 15 from the Migration series. And you begin to see the range of his compositions and his mood and his tone. So here he portrays just a single lone figure huddled over in despair on the banks of a river. The river, often kind of a sense of water, of escape, of what you cross to get away. But the realization that genuine freedom for American blacks is really problematic. So you have this terrible despairing, this single branch with a noose sticking out there. You see his brushwork, you see his color sensibility, and it begins to be a very, very expressive body of work to communicate to us the cultural experience of his group. We're here another panel, funeral taking place. Or here another, one of the largest race riots occurred in East St. Louis because as people crowded into cities and there was a lot of poverty, then very difficult things began to happen, tensions grow up, and there were a number of race riots. Notice how his abstract forms begin to really express the meaning or the feeling of his subject matter. So that here in this violence, you have extremely angular, sharp, hard-edged forms that really, on a formal level, express violence. Whereas in the previous ones, some of his forms were more curving and expressed more the mood of those. And here another, and you can see there the caption race riots were very numerous all over the North because of the antagonism that was caused between the Negro and white workers. Many of these riots occurred because the workers were used as a strike breaker in many of the northern industries. I read that to you because this layers in another theme that we're going to be seeing on and off in American art in the 20s and 30s and 40s, which is the theme of labor, of work, of poverty, of laws of wealthy people who oppress workers. And out of that, the labor unions rise up. The labor unions typically were formed by whites and were a way to get white factory owners and tycoons to share some of the wealth. Those owners wanted to break the strike, and they did that by hiring people who were not in the union. Because the unions had their own racism and blacks were not so welcome there, the wealthy white owners were able to hire blacks who had moved to the north and were desperate for work to work instead of the whites, and therefore to break the strikes, which in the end caused strife between white workers and black workers, with the wealthy playing one off the other. Actually, before we leave Lawrence, though, I want to say, just mention a number of other series he did. He did a major series on Harriet Tubman, the escaped slave, a woman who escaped from the South, became a free black in the North, and helped develop the Underground Railroad for many, many black slaves to escape. He did a series on black workers. He did a series on black athletes. He did a series on black musicians. So his achievement is huge because he's giving visibility and celebration and witness, as it were, to the experiences of black culture. By being such a superb painter, he begins to bring that into the consciousness even of white culture very slowly. So really significant figure. Romery Bearden, in many ways, is similar. Bearden also had this huge career. He began actually working as an artist journalist for the Baltimore Sun, which was a black newspaper. And there he did pieces that were really kind of political cartoons, propaganda. As he's doing those, he becomes increasingly aware of the high art tradition of European modernism, and falls in love with the idea of that high art tradition. And he decides to shift from being a journalist, reportage artist, to being a fine artist. He also shifts in doing that from being someone who's doing straight protest and aggressive work related to race to doing work that is more celebratory and explorative of black experience. And that, in fact, makes him very, very unique because he still clearly has a racial conscience and is dealing with black identity. But he decided that artists who only did political or propagandistic work were going to be pigeonholed, and in the end were going to produce a limited body of work in terms of its scope of human meaning and expression. As he makes that shift, however, he does not leave behind kind of found imagery that you might think of as associated with photography and journalism. And primarily that's because he makes a shift into doing collage. Now this is partly influenced by European modernism, Picasso and Braque and collage and so on. But also he finds a way to have that dip deep into American experience and into African experience. So you're looking here at a collage that comes from a series he did about ritual. This one is the prevalence of ritual baptism. And you can see here he has collaged images from newspapers, from photographs. And if you start looking at the fragments, some of them are like literally lifted out of things like Life magazine, stories reporting about black experience. Others are lifted from art books and show fragments of African masks and sculpture. Others show parts of the landscape. In the upper left, for example, you see a church steeple and a locomotive. All of this he collages together to create his kind of own fragmentary image. And I think for him, collage is so profound because if you think about the cultural experience of African Americans, particularly early 20th century, part of their experience runs to slavery. Part runs back to their memory and the oral tradition of Africa. Part of it runs to being freed. Part of it runs to different culture, African art, European art, American art. In a sense, the cultural experience of African Americans is a collage. It's a series of elements and fragments from a lot of different parts, unlike the more, quote, unified experience of white Americans. So Bearden makes a really wonderful and profound use out of this medium and this imagery to create a unique body that bears witness to experience. I do want to bring in a photographer here just to touch on her, Helen Levitt, African American photographer, who's also exploring these city scenes very wonderfully. Even though using the camera gets these kind of abstract compositions. And so the point being that there's various media and various artists interested in exploring this whole business of the urban scene here. Here's another Bearden, this one kind of hybrid collage painting, and it's part of a theme that he took up as a series where he's exploring the blues and jazz, these forms of African American music. And I want you to notice the way he abstracts. He chooses these kind of syncopated rhythms of forms that echoes actually the syncopated rhythms of sound in jazz, so that he's trying to find a sync between visual and oral music forms here with very vivid, bright colors. So an idea that we saw running through both Lawrence and Bearden was this idea of American experience, in their case, African American experience. And I want to lay this out as a theme, this idea of American experience, or to make it a little more formal, American identity. This is a theme that's going to run deeply through the 1920s and 30s. In fact, it's going to be a question that is at the forefront for artists. Part of that is because American culture finally kind of came of age as a significant world power with World War I. We proved that we were a military might. We proved that our democracy held up. We proved that we could gather resources to fight that war, and in some ways to bring victory to that war with our joining in. And so after the war, people started recognizing America, in fact, is established. But they realized we're established militarily, economically, politically, but not necessarily spiritually and artistically. And every culture needs an artistic identity to be fully present. So this question of what's American, what is our experience, how do we bear witness to that experience, that's going to run through all of this work, and that's obviously one of the major themes I want you to explore in both of your take-home exams. So let's turn to another artist, actually an artist that is part of a bit of a movement, and I'm going to show you 3 artists from this movement, and we'll explore this a little bit further, but in a very different way. So the artist here is Charles Sheeler, and he's part of what becomes known as the precisionist movement, the idea of precision being at the heart of that. Sheeler's very interested in the American landscape. In fact, that's the title of this painting. And if you say, well, okay, what would be the American landscape? Well, we've talked about landscape in the 19th century, but now we've seen in the late 19th, early 20th century how in a way the weight of the culture is moving towards the cities, towards industrialization, manufacturing, and urban settings. So Sheeler here suggests that the American landscape is now an industrial modernist machine landscape, and this is met with great enthusiasm in the time. There's even a movement called machine aesthetics, where the machine is greatly admired and manufacturing is greatly admired. We still admire these today, but there's also now problematic with the environment. But Sheeler celebrates it, but he celebrates it in his own very quiet, precisionist way. As you can see here, he's using a very precise, detailed kind of realism, almost a photorealism. And in doing that, he's favoring real crisp edges, flat shapes, almost a flattening of space. Scenes without people typically. They're quiet, they're silent, not the bustling throb of industry. So in a way, it's almost like they are meditations on these scenes rather than direct involvements in them. And it ends up producing a very formal, kind of abstract / realistic approach, which is part of what makes it iconic and directly from experience. Now, Sheeler also worked in photography, the camera itself being a machine. And so here you see him photographing those same industrial sites that he also painted, this one being the Ford plant. And what he finds here, and this photograph is so perfect on that, is both this sort of realism, kind of almost a photographic realism, but also an abstraction. By the way he positions the camera and chooses the composition and develops the black and white and middle tones. He stresses both an abstract element to this scene as well as a very realistic image of this scene. So this is an interesting thing that's developing in American modernism, a kind of merger of realism and abstraction. So we've seen Sheeler as a painter and as a photographer. I want to just quickly drop back and do one other painting by him, Americana, where again he's asking the American question. This time giving us an interior view. In a sense, you could think of this almost as a still life or a domestic interior. The objects he's chosen are as important as the style that he's using here. The furniture he's showing us, that wooden carved tray and that oval shaped wooden box on the table there, as well as the table itself, as well as that little half round gate leg table over there in the upper back of the painting, as well as the woven rugs. All of these come from American design in the period, particularly Shaker design. The Shakers were an offshoot of the Amish and the Quakers, and they were dedicated to a very simple life and to high-level craft in what they made. And Shaker design is really beautifully simple, minimal, elegant, and essential. And Sheeler admired that enormously as an American expression. So here he's given us kind of a view from above, maybe from a staircase or something, where you're seeing the patterns in the rug, the fabrics, the chairs, the boxes, the things made, where he's celebrating that kind of really simple aesthetic, and at the same time is making a painting that embraces that very simple aesthetic. So I want to turn now to a second artist that's in this precisionist group along with Sheeler, and that would be the painter Charles Demuth. I'm going to show you a watercolor because he's such a great watercolorist, as well as two important oil paintings. Let's start with the watercolor, Bermuda #1, Tree and House. And here you see what is becoming a really key American solution to what an American painting and style might look like. This painting is basically a hybrid of naturalism. You can see the organic forms of tree and leaves, branches, some hillsides, some houses, blended with abstract structure, in particular with Cubism. Demuth has become impressed with Cubism. He's trying to figure out how it's done, but he's also looking for kind of an American hybrid. Remember, we saw that with all the Stieglitz Circle, how they went from modernist abstraction and then regrounded in nature in order to get a kind of hybrid American solution. So here Demuth does it with great elegance. Let's turn now and look at two paintings that I think bear some really significant ideas in terms of this kind of American style. The first of those two is this painting, My Egypt. And here he's done a clever thing with the title. By referencing Egypt, of course, he asks us to remember ancient cultures, and that cultures have a long history. He summons up one of those, Egypt. And if I were to say to you, what is the single image you might use as the icon of ancient Egypt, it would probably be the Great Pyramids. And I think Demuth here is referencing that, but he's sort of saying, well, if you were to choose the single most iconic image for the American landscape, what would you choose? Here he's chosen grain elevators. This represents our great open plains, our harvesting of wheat and so on. Every city's got a grain elevator if they've got a railroad. He chooses that as kind of his American pyramid. Goes to the question of identity and who we are. And then he paints it in this kind of hybrid style where there's pretty strong elements of naturalism. You can see light and shadow modeling in 3 dimensions and hints at perspective. But he also intersects that with a cubist structure, those divisions of geometric planes that sort of section up the painting and the space for us. Now, as I said, he's fascinated by Cubism, but I'm not sure he understands the inner logic of Cubism, the way Picasso and Braque invented it. But he has the gist of it. And so he does something here to find his own logic to guide his Cubist divisions. And I think it's a pretty brilliant moment because basically he chooses something grounded in natural observation, namely the power lines that we stretch from pole to pole. If you look at those power lines and look at the negative spaces between the wires, you get geometric abstract forms. And so Demuth, it seems to me, takes the logic of that and uses it to divide up this image into a rather lively, dynamic cubist form with diagonals and a sense of movement, which meets that naturalism. It's a great American solution. Here in the other Demuth that I want you to know, the figure 5 in gold. He's now developed that style and you can see it in action here. Here the cubist abstraction is maybe a little more radical. The font of number 5 and some of the words clear enough. That's lifted from the culture. The red element you see is actually a fire truck, sort of done a la Cubism. And that fire truck is racing down a street at night in a city. So if you look at the gray, black, white forms, you see skyscrapers and street lamps, all simplified and abstracted, so that you get this kind of throbbing sense of 5 repeated, like 5, 5, 5, 5, and then that red shining out in that black. Now, this painting has a very specific source. Demuth was friends with one of our great poets at the time, William Carlos Williams. And Williams had written a poem called I Saw the Number 5 in Gold. Now, Williams is crucial here. He's part of a movement of American poets who are trying to kind of reinvent poetry. Their school of thought is called Imagist poetry. And their goal is to write a poem that's extremely abstracted, extremely simplified. Just a few key words, sometimes just one word in a line and then a column of those single words, sometimes pairs or triplets of words. But the goal being to use the fewest words possible and yet create a really poignant image that floats in the mind. The poem, I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold, was actually drawn from an experience that Williams had. He was standing one night on the street in his city in the dark and heard the siren of a fire truck coming at him. He saw the fire truck approach, flash by him, and then recede rapidly into the distance between the tall buildings. And that was such a lingering image for him that he wrote the poem as a way of trying to reconstruct that image for his reader. So Demuth takes that, he's in love with that poem, and here he makes a visual equivalent of it, where the 5 getting smaller and smaller suggests the receding away of the fire truck. And then where he puts all kinds of little graphic design clues about the poet in. If you look at the bottom, you can see red initials of the poet Williams, Carlos Williams, WCW. On the far left bottom corner, you can see Demuth's own initial, CD, or up top, the word Bill, nickname for William, or Carlo on the side of that building, and so on. So a kind of an imagist painting after imagist poetry with that great hybrid of naturalism and abstraction that Americans are coming to love. Really briefly, one last precisionist work by Ralston Crawford. I feel like this guy's a really great painter, and he gets left out a lot, so I'm going to at least toss one of his works in, Overseas Highway. Now here, his subject matter is actually very modern, very much part of this modern urban industrial scene. It is a modern bridge related to a modern highway. We take these for granted, but the interstate highway system and highway engineering was very new at the time. Crawford here takes this great sort of street level view, as if you're kind of squatting down or sitting down or kneeling down on the road and seeing the perspective of this handrail, not a handrail, this guardrail, zooming into that horizon at a vanishing point. Then the far side rail joining it, and then that lining up with that horizon between deep blue water and light blue sky. This is an amazing meeting of really very naturalistic observation and quite abstract construction. And he makes it seem so easy, so minimal. I've always thought people should look more at Crawford because his work feels very modern, very contemporary even still to me. Okay, I want to move on now to another small movement. And you can see that here in this little bit later work, Synchrony in Green and Orange. Now, we've got to talk about that title a little bit first. That word synchrony is really crucial. In fact, this movement that MacDonald Wright and the next two artists are part of came to be called synchronism. So S-Y-N meaning with, chromy or chromism meaning colors. So literally just with colors. And that's their whole point. They are building paintings out of color and color relationships. Synchrony is a great word. They liked, however, the way it punned off of symphony. Symphony being a musical form, basically sem being with and phony meaning sound. Say a great symphony is a musical composition out of abstract forms, each having its own color tonality. And they like this kind of parallel between music and painting. And I think that helped them justify the abstraction. Nonetheless, MacDonald Wright likes to ground it a little bit more. And so if you've been looking at this painting while I'm talking, you maybe by now have found how he has grounded it. It is in fact a figure, a nude figure. If you look at the top there, you can see a kind of oval with a pointy chin form and a bridge of a nose, or rather cubist looking kind of face. Move off each side of that, you can see rounded shoulders. You can see that the figure has one is sitting down, one leg kind of folded under it, and the other leg, the knee pulled up, the figure's right arm resting on the figure's right knee, the figure's left arm extended out, hand on the ground, and so on. You can find it there if you look. And that seems to give MacDonald Wright a structure, a scaffolding that he's comfortable with as he sort of cubicizes that figure with colored forms. Second of that synchronous group is Morgan Russell. Now, Morgan Russell's interesting. He's a little, in my mind, a little more adventurous. He dares to paint really purely abstractly, deciding that, in fact, color does exist in nature, and color is a structure. So I would still say this is in a way grounded in nature, but not so much in an object in nature or a perspective space or figure kind of thing, but more just in color itself. And he trusts that. But he does like this music thing because I think that helps give a kind of logic. So here I think one of the really nice Morgan Russell paintings, 4-part Synchrony number 7. And of course that's playing directly off of music where you often would have a 4-part symphony number whatever. Or it might be a symphony in the key of G. And in fact, Russell here is working in a color key. It's not a musical key like major and minor, but it's a color key. And so he actually gives us 4 paintings that are then composed together into a larger rectangle. So you have a whole painting that's 1 and 4 parts within it, each being distinct. Now, if you know how symphonies work, you know they typically have a variety of different movements within them. One might, for example, be a scherzo, which is a fast, rapid, lively dance. There might be an allegro, or there might be a largo, a very slow moving. And so if you look at each composition, you see that each one has a kind of different rhythm or syncopation, creates a bit different mood, and yet they all look quite fine together. So really nice kind of solution. And then quickly, just one last synchronist, Patrick Henry Bruce. Actually, I think a really fine abstract painter. Sadly, lived a short life, tragically ended his life, and has not gotten as much press probably as he should have. And I won't say a lot about this work, but essentially you can see he is basically working off the motif of a still life. That's his grounding. Still life of geometric forms. Maybe they're objects, maybe they're just forms. And then he's working these kind of color harmonies that he likes. He's also playing a kind of flat 2D pattern design against a perspective 3D pattern. So that some of the objects there look 3D, some look flat, but all of them kind of pop in and out of being 2D and 3D. So you get this nice quiet kind of mediation between space and flatness, depth and flatness with these objects. Really a handsome painting. All right, let's move to a whole different kind of thing. And I want to move to the Dada movement. I'm showing you here a French Dada painting, one of the most famous French Dada paintings by Marcel Duchamp, a work called Nude Descending a Staircase. Now I'm starting with this European work for a couple of reasons. One is I want to say a couple words about Dadaism. Not all of you have maybe had the class where we discussed this. So I want to make sure you know what Dadaism is. But then secondly, because this particular painting was one of the most infamous paintings in that famous Armory show of 1913 that we talked about earlier with the Stieglitz Circle. And it was one of the works that caused Americans to either love or almost hate European modernists and abstraction. So Dada movement is going to be important that way for Americans. But secondly, the Dada movement was a kind of protest movement in and of itself that was protesting World War I and some of the absurdities and atrocities of war. And part of Duchamp's strategy was to protest or defy the traditional aesthetic idea that art is about beauty. Instead, he wanted art to be about ideas, concepts, and often even difficult concepts. He thought art ought to make us think more than feel, and he had a somewhat cynical orientation to thinking about life, and I think a lot of that was formed by the horrors of World War I and some of the cynical thought against idealism that war produced in Europe. In America, we'll see a little less of that cynicism, but we will see a playfulness that comes out of Duchamp. So here, this is a key painting then, maybe to understand a bit what Americans are doing. And then there's one other Duchamp, which we also really need to have to understand in order to get Dadaism. So this is Marcel Duchamp's piece called Fountain. Okay, now that label's deceptive. This is an Alfred Stieglitz photograph of Marcel Duchamp's sculpture, The Fountain. So don't confuse this as a Stieglitz. But we got to talk about this work a little bit, and some of you know about it, some of you maybe don't. So I'll say a few things. Duchamp actually came to New York, and he spent quite a bit of time in New York, actually, and he got a following among young American artists. While he was in New York, there was a group of artists that wanted to have an exhibition of art that was open. Typically, an exhibition was run by an academy or an art school, and they had jurors. And so artists would submit work, and the jurors would then go through and select work that fit their aesthetic ideals, which in this traditional times were usually ideals of beauty, idealization, and so on. And then the jurors would throw out any work that they didn't think made the cut. So there's this group of young artists that thought, we're tired of this jurying process. We want exhibitions that allow experimentation, openness, diversity of style, and so on. So they posted an ad for an exhibition, and they said that for the exhibition there would be no juror, there would be no rules, just working artists could submit work. So Duchamp, who was an accomplished artist at the time, submitted this piece. And even that group wanted to kick it out. They found it so outrageous. But he reminded them that there were no jurors and no exclusions, so the piece stayed in. So this piece is like a hand grenade thrown into the history of art and culture. It defies traditional aesthetics on every level, but it does so cleverly with a pun. Okay, so the first pun being, this is porcelain. This is white ceramic porcelain. It looks like marble. And the tradition of idealized beauty in the Western canon goes all the way back to Greek idealized marble sculptures. And so Duchamp is leveraging off of that, but of course he's throwing it back on our face because it's not marble, and it is in fact not even a lovely figure, although it has a figurative quality because of it being set on its side. But in fact, it is a urinal from a men's bathroom. So instead of high beauty, it references the lowest functions. Instead of an ideal body, it represents the lower parts of the body that get rid of waste products. So in addition, he titled this, and of course that title, Fountain. There's a long tradition in European high art of elegant fountains. Usually they have classical figures, mythological figures, sprouting water from whatever orifice they might possess. In this case, there's a fountain involved, but it's the fountain of men peeing into a urinal. When the juror or the group objected that this was not art, Duchamp says, well, it is art because I'm an artist and I've signed and dated it. So you'll notice his signature, R. Mutt. That's one of his pseudonyms. And of course, a mutt references a dog that is not a purebred, maybe a mangy, scroungy dog. And you all know what mutts do as they run around the alleyways of a city. They lift their leg and mark or pee everywhere in order to stake out their territory. So we have a scroungy dog peeing on things, referencing men peeing in a urinal, referencing the high tradition of European idealized art. The final way to understand this is that date, 1917. This is the third year of the First World War. And by the third year, it was obvious to everyone that that war was brutal. It was killing people by the millions, and it had basically been started by either aristocrats or wealthy manufacturers for all the wrong motives. That was an absurd war. And historians kind of look at it that way now. Well, the Dadaist group was a group of artists that were directly protesting that war by making absurd work as a challenge. And so, in essence, then, I think Duchamp's view here is World War I in Europe was really nothing more than a pissing contest by a lot of fat cat men who were making a lot of money or gaining political power at the expense of the soldiers who were killed by the millions. So this piece, in a way, references this idea of of men in a pissing contest. Now, in terms of how he actually made this piece, there's some very revolutionary ideas going on here. It is intentionally not made by the artist's hands. It requires no skill, no training. It is what Duchamp called a found object, in French, l'objet trouvé, or what he also called a ready-made. So it's something that was already made by non-artists for a different context that the artist has found and realizes has some poetic associations with meaning. And so the artist appropriates that thing out of life and puts it on a pedestal into art. That logic becomes major for a great deal of modern art and is still powerful today in contemporary art. So, all this said, one last thing about Duchamp. He was a very charismatic person, and he drew a following of young American artists. So let's look a little bit at some of the artists that embraced a more or less Dada aesthetic. Let's look first at Man Ray. Man Ray did sculpture and photography. He's quite innovative. He also, by the way, did fashion photography, which is how I think he paid a lot of the bills, to allow him to be free to experiment with pretty radical art that at that time very few in the American public are going to be willing to buy, although now we look back and see him as pretty brilliant. So let's look at this piece first, Compass, where obviously he is using found objects. He's using a toy pistol and a big U magnet. You can see the N there on the right leg of the U magnet. The magnet is suspended. It is placed on a wall. The magnet is suspended by a string, and the pistol is stuck to the magnet by magnetic power. So he's taken two found objects, right, ready-mades, that were not art, but he's imported them into art. And he's done something that the Dadists invented, which is you take found objects and you combine them in a way that's surprising, maybe shocking or irrational. Doesn't make a lot of sense to say, I'm going to put a pistol and a magnet together. But in doing that, you create new meanings by the mutual associations of the objects. And this is a really nice case in point. So that magnet, especially showing that in, because magnets are oriented on the compass, and the compass, which is magnetic in its needle, can point to north because it aligns magnetically with the axis of the Earth. And so if you think one of the ways that we know where we are is we use a compass. And a compass points us to what we call true north. It's true, right? It's reliable. It's a direction. And by that, we can then map the world and know where we are. This is one of the ways humans create order in the sort of randomness of nature. So in this case, then, a magnet would do that operation. But in fact, the needle, as it were, is not a little needle with a pointing arrow on it. The needle is the barrel of that gun that is stuck to the magnet. And so in this way, Man Ray raises this question. What is true north? What is truth? What is order? And is that a violent thing? Is that something we acquire through military and weapons and killing? It's playful, it's poetic, but it's also quite poignant and serious. Here we have another Man Ray sculpture, this one called Gift. And here again, he juxtaposes two kinds of found objects that in life don't have anything to do with each other. A flat iron that you would use to iron your clothes, and carpet tacks or upholstery tacks that you would use to make your chair nicely upholstered. Each has its own meaning in life, but he puts them together in this poetic association, and something new happens. So what's an iron for? It's to make us look good. It's fashionable. It irons out the chaos in your clothes after they come out of the wash. That's cloth. carpet tack, or upholstery tacks are meant to manage cloth, but when applied to the iron like this, if you were to use them on your shirt, you would destroy your shirt. So you have this kind of strange thing of two functional objects when combined becoming destructive. And then the sort of absurdity of calling it gift. In what sense is this a gift? Well, it's hard to say. And it's part of that openness of meaning, where we construct the meaning that the Dadists appreciated. I want to look at a couple of things dealing with photography by Man Ray. Now, what I'm not showing you, but you can easily do a Google image search, which you should, and you'll find examples of his fashion photography and his portrait photography and his nude figure photography, which in many ways are more traditional and more commercially useful for him. But what I like about him is that on the side, or maybe the fashion was on the sides and this is at the core, but at any rate, he has a very curious experimental mind. And so as he explored photography, one of the things he got interested in was the idea of creating abstract photography by using found objects juxtaposed poetically and just bypass the camera altogether. Very cunning idea. Of course, by now this is a well-established form. So he does that by taking things and going into the darkroom and simply placing things on the photographic paper and exposing the paper briefly and then developing it, bypassing the camera altogether. He didn't know what these things were, and so he cleverly called them rayographs. They're not photographs, they're rayographs, and of course Ray plays off his name, but it also plays off the idea that you're shining light rays onto the photosensitive paper to create these objects. So here's a really nice example of that, where you have a gyroscope, and you can see just a little bit of the string that the gyroscope would balance on as it spins. And then down the right side, a bit of film strip with multiple exposures of the profile of a man's head, and the rest being black. And then in the lower left corner, an object placed there, perhaps a piece of a puzzle. How these mean is very oblique, right? It's very poetic, and not to be taken literally, but rather to be taken poetically. Here's another example of a rayograph where you can see him experimenting with things that reference other things. So, so this is a little bit more of American Dadaism. It's not as cynical, it probably is European, but it certainly is playful and experimental. We'll look just for a moment at one other work that has long been treated as part of American Dadaism. This is a sculpture by Morton Schomburg, and it's titled God. It's from 1918, into World War I. And in some ways, I mean, Schomburg's sort of presented as a Dadaist, although I'm not sure he is overall. I'm going to show you a couple of paintings after to kind of raise that question. But this piece certainly does feel Dadaistic. What you're looking at here is a wooden platform, which is actually a miter box, a carpenter's miter box, which is a little box that's used to help a carpenter cut correct angles at 90 degrees or 45 degrees or 30 degrees for carpentry. He's taken that miter box, he's turned it upside down. You can see 3 slots there on the side of it for the 90, the 45, and the 30 degree cuts. And then he's taken plumbing, sink trap actually, and mounted that so that it rises up in this kind of curving form, entitled it God. Now I have scholar friends who think the 3 cuts at different degrees are humorously suggesting the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 different manifestations of God as pure spirit, as God in the flesh, and as Holy Spirit being the thing between pure God and God in the flesh. Perhaps, I don't know. The plumbing may well be a reference to Duchamp, because when Duchamp came to America and got to know the culture a bit and was asked, what do you think of American culture? He really poked at this central question we're examining here of does America even have a good art form? Do they have an artistic identity yet? And what he said was he thought America was great because it had produced the world's best engineers and plumbers, implying that it had not produced very great art yet. And it's possible that this is a little jab at Duchamp's statement here. At any rate, it's a found object, or actually two found objects combined irrationally to make us think, and that is at the heart of Dadaism. Now, like I said, I want to just quickly look at a little bit of a painting by Schomburg. And maybe this is Dadaistic, maybe not. It's ambiguous to me. This one, for example, called Machine. He did a number of paintings dealing with machines. And of course, machines we associate as being useful, as making things that we need. And as I've said, there is a machine aesthetic going on where machines are also found beautiful in their formal qualities. So Duchamp here paints us a machine. I'm not sure if we've figured out what this machine is useful for. And that may be, if it has a Dada element, it may be that he's suggesting a beautiful machine that does nothing, or that's useless. At any rate, it has a great design quality as well as a bit of a puzzle to it conceptually. And we can see Schomburg experimenting with these kinds of forms. Here, for example, he pushes it to a more abstract level. I don't know that this is Dada humor, though, or Dada protest. It might be just kind of actually rather beautiful abstract formal study. Although here again we have another machine, what was then a newfangled machine, the telephone. This to me, could be as much basically a paean of praise of the machine and of the phone and all that it means, as much as a criticism of it. Schomburg's an interesting character, though. All right, let's move to another group of artists who organized a different group in American culture. This is a group that called themselves the American Abstract Artists. And they were a group of artists who favored kind of pure and geometric abstraction, very interested in that from its European origins, but in particular felt that that kind of abstraction was a universal language, that anyone in any culture could and would value the experience of pure abstract work. Although they were interested in American culture having strong art, they didn't think it needed to be completely grounded in realism or references. So let's work through a few of these artists. The first I want to look at is Ilya Bolotowsky. He's actually a Russian immigrant, and he grew up in Russia and immigrated here as a young adult. He's been very influenced by Picasso, Braque, Léger, Miro, and a number of others, and you can see all that in this abstraction if you know those European artists. And there was a fair number of Americans working this way, but the AAA group, American Abstract Artists Group, ultimately tended to favor a tighter, more precise geometric abstraction. So let's look at another Bolotowsky. You can see that here in blue rectangles, which is a little more severe, probably a little more influenced by Mondrian and his De Stijl group in Europe, and undoubtedly by artists from the Bauhaus as well, where you get this really nicely structured, symmetrical, asymmetrical tension, primary color, gray tones with a couple of secondary tones put in, kind of a syncopated rhythm. Really very handsome painting. Or this last Bolotowsky we'll look at, a tondo. A tondo is a round painting. It goes actually all the way back through the Renaissance to ancient Rome. Very traditional form with a beautifully designed red geometry structure in the center. Okay, I hope this one records. And also I hope this one does. And I hope this one does. And I hope this one does as well. Now, in apparent pitched contrast to what we were just looking at, I want to move to a number of artists who are dealing much more in the realist tradition. But this gets subtle, and I want you to really attend to this. For example, this artist, Edward Hopper, we're going to look at him and we're going to think about subject and narrative and so on. But I also want you to be very aware of the abstractness in his paintings, because he's actually radically abstracting and composing. He's playing geometric shapes. He's very aware of form against form. So in his own way, his work is a kind of meeting of abstraction and realism. It's just not so much the European examples that we've been looking at that are shaping him here. So let's start with this painting, House by the Railroad. This is hands down one of the iconic American paintings of the 20s. And in fact, critics that wrote about Hopper raved on about his ability to capture the soul, the sensibility of American life in the 20s. And one of the things they actually emphasized was a sense of isolation, even loneliness, a kind of silence, kind of an American reluctance. And I think he gets that very beautifully here. So on the abstract level, he simplifies his painting really radically to a flat sky. It's nuanced enough that you do read sky and cloud, but it's essentially a flat plane. That centralized house form, which is very architectural, but also is very much geometric shapes, pitched against that lower horizontal form of the railroad bed and the railroad ties, which he's pushed to the color red. So you get a flat, a vertical, and a horizontal structured together, and they are really, really simplified. This is an unusual angle of viewing that you probably couldn't really get, but he composes it, he constructs it. On the narrative or subject matter side, it's incredibly effective for giving us a sense of this American climate of loneliness, of isolation, and of silence that Hopper seems to have felt. So he gives us this house, and normally you think of a house as an inviting place where one resides. But this one seems very isolated. There are no neighbors here. And the way he handles details like the blinds in the window, most of them are closed, a few are partly open, half open, a couple are all the way open, which almost suggests an animation to the house or a kind of dynamic psychological quality to that house. But then all of that, which in a way, it should be inviting, you want to go into a house and dwell there, all of that is cut off from us by this railroad track that slices across the bottom of the composition, edge to edge, and creates a barrier for us. In fact, we cannot even visually get on the front porch. The front steps and porch are eliminated from our view. And by eliminating them with a railroad track, the implication is a railroad track, train comes by or leaves. It travels. This house is stationary. Railroad track suggests movement or travel or rootlessness. The house is rooted, but we're rootless if we ride the rails. There's a really beautiful set of tensions in this painting that work very much psychologically, and that's part of its abstract content. And Hopper is able to spin the American environment in these ways that cause us to really contemplate the human condition as we live in this culture. Maybe the most famous of Hopper's paintings is Nighthawks. And here again, he plays with ways to create that tension by merging very abstract structure with very realistic imagery. One of the main metaphors here is inside outside, whereas in House by the Railroad Track, it was being stationary and rooted versus being restless and moving or traveling. Here it's inside outside. So you have a sense that you belong when you're inside a well-lit space at night. You're with others. If you're outside looking in, you're an outsider, right? You're not at home. You're not comfortable. And so he sets up that kind of psychological tension here. He enhances that by having this building move away across from us diagonally, and that sidewalk and street sweep around and then head down a street that we can't even see very far down, with that really lonely building there on the left on the opposite side of the street. Look at that building on the opposite side of the street. Look up at the windows on the second story. How he treats those like abstract compositions with their shades, half down, the green shade, the upper part, then the open blackness of the interior. But then that one has that little kind of gray triangle to it. That gray triangle does so much to make that a mysterious place. And there's always a kind of mystery and silence in Hopper. Notice how that little gray triangle is repeated if you go down to the street level, and just to the right, inside that show window, there's a lighter gray triangle. He repeats forms. And on the abstract level, his formal composition is so brilliant that he picks up and rhymes forms so you don't quite realize it. You might even notice, for example, if you look in through the big window at those people at the soda fountain, that yellow wall behind the woman in red, look at where it meets the corner there, where the window and the wall meet, and there's a triangle in shadow there that's echoing those gray triangles on the left side of the painting. Just throughout, he is repeating forms and creating shapes and spaces that are very effective psychologically. So now let's look inside that well-lit space from the shadowy exterior. And as you look in there, you see four people. So there is community, you could say. There's a group of folks, but they really are not communicating. They're not connected. In fact, they're silent and they're alienated. The man with his back to us on the left balances the guy making the sodas or whatever in his white cap on the right. Between is a couple, and so you think of them as together. And yet if they are together, they don't seem to be enjoying each other very much. They're just kind of there, both looking straight forward. So he sets up relationships by posture and space between, and also by rhythms of forms. So look again at the man at the counter with his back to us. He's a single form. He's alone. Just off his right elbow are elements on the counter over there. Sugar dispenser, a napkin holder. There's two forms there. So we have the man is one form, then the utensils is two forms, then a big gap, and then a man is one, a woman is one, but a man and woman is two, then another gap, then the soda fountain guy is one, and then behind him those two coffee urns is two, then a gap, and then a door. So he's got this syncopated rhythm of 1, 2, space, 2, space, 1, space, 2, space, 1. It's like a meter, a poetry meter to his work. And it's very, very captivating. I won't comment a lot on this, but I have to throw this in. New York Movie. This is one of the first paintings we've seen where a painter includes the movie theater and a motion picture going on. So that's pretty interesting. And of course, that's part of American life now. Actually, by the 20s here, we're into what they called the talkies, which was the movies with voice. And that's what you're seeing here. But look at the way Hopper composes this, the viewing angle he gives us. This painting is split in half with a strong left and a strong right half. On the left half, you can see two figures there seated in the theater seats watching a movie, and you can see the silver screen there. And of course, movies were in black and white at that time. So you see that black and white moving, talking image, which is cool, right? The grays are cool. And yet the colors in the interior are warm. And these figures sit there alone watching that. This is one of the weird things about movies. Even when the movie theater's full, it's a group of people in community who are each in complete isolation, privately watching the movie for themselves. And there's a weird tension in that, and Hopper picks that up here. Then he divides this with the kind of door jamb and ornamental column there. And then to the right, we see the usher, young woman there working in the theater, a little bit bored, kind of waiting. Maybe she's listening to the film. She's probably heard it 20 times or more. And then that opening in the curtains where you could go up into the balcony, which implies another space, but a hidden space. So what I want you to see here is how he uses figures in relation to spaces, to things that separate them or unite them, to colors, to abstract compositions, to create these really very complex and imagination-grabbing scenarios. I want to look at one other Hopper painting, and I've chosen this one partly because it does all these things we're talking about, but also partly because we happen to have a lot of preparatory sketches by him for the composition of this painting. And it becomes really, really interesting to see that. So we have a scene in an office, business office. And of course, business is the business of America this time. This is so American. The man in the suit at the desk with the green desk lamp, pushing papers, typewriter, a secretary, and so on. So here he is. You have the feeling they're working late, office at night. It's dark out that window. You see that shade pulled half down. I want you to notice that the string of that shade is slightly blowing in the wind. There is a breeze coming into this space, and that breeze is more than just wind. It suggests something psychological between these two figures. So the old stereotype, right? The office man, the wealthy businessman, whatever, who has an affair with his secretary. You see his secretary there standing up, filing, but she turns and looks at him. She's wearing a very tight dress. She's very curvaceous, and she pauses and looks at him. This may be nothing more than an exchange of two people working. Maybe she's saying, do you want me to file so-and-so under A? Maybe nothing more than that. He seems to not look at her. And yet Hopper has this way of creating a tension between them. That string blowing in the wind implies a sort of breeze going across them. Now, he does something incredibly subtle here. You have to look carefully. The wall is a white wall, and you see the man silhouetted against the white wall. You see the secretary and the filing cabinet silhouetted there. And it's a kind of a medium white tone on that wall. But you'll notice that there's a rectangle of lighter white, purer white, also on that wall. This, of course, is light shining in from a window. Actually, the window we are looking through. Hopper often makes us voyeurs, as if we're maybe in the room or maybe we're opposite the building looking through. But at any rate, the window we're looking through must be illuminated because it's cast a rectangle of white light on that wall. Now, look at what that smaller, whiter rectangle encompasses. It encompasses the man and the woman, as well as the filing cabinet. Almost like there's a story within the story here. And maybe this is their desire or their antagonism, who knows? But at any rate, it implies pretty interesting things. Now, one of the reasons that I maybe dare to suggest this kind of dialogue and perhaps this kind of desire between them is because the sketches show him changing his mind about the position of that secretary, as well as a few other things like that paler white square rectangle on the wall that combines them together. Let's look a little bit at some of the sketches. Here's a nice example. You'll notice, by the way, how they're much closer together here in the final painting. He's pulled them apart further. That gap between them is incredibly important. If it's too close, it's too intimate. If it's too far away, there's no buzz between them. But if it's just right, then there's a tension between them. Now, in this case, you'll notice he has her standing, kind of her whole body and head turned towards him. Not that kind of serpentine curve where we saw the curve of her butt and then twisting the curve of her breasts and then twisted more her face. So this seems like a more neutral relationship then. He's not looking at her, she's facing him. There's less complexity to it, as it were. He's also put a picture hanging on that back wall behind the man, which disrupts that large pale wall and makes it less of a psychological space in which they both exist, and also downplays or eliminates the possibility of that lighter white rectangle that unites them. Or here is a third composition that he did in his sketches. In this case, there's still that picture on the wall, and you can see here there is an illumination on the wall coming in the window. If you look up near the top of the frame, just off to the right, you see a bit of a darker gray triangle there, and you realize all that light's coming in the window there from the side. But it's not a shape that selects the man and woman out and isolates them together against a larger wall. So there's no psychological mileage gained in that. And in this case, she too is less complex. Now she's standing frontally to the cabinet with her head slightly turned to the side to look at him, and he is slightly turned to the side. So it feels like a more relaxed or casual, perhaps, conversation between them that has a lot less of that kind of sexual tension. Whereas here in the last sketch, you see him coming closer to the final choices that he's making. And here her body, her one foot is inclined towards him. Her rear end is parallel to the cabinet, but she twists her body so her breasts are more presented towards him, and her face is as well. And there's that white rectangle on the wall behind, uniting them, all of which he fine-tuned in that final painting. Now, Hopper's always understated, though, and you could say, oh, you're imagining all this, Wayne, and maybe I am. Point is, the way he draws us into the narrative, we position ourselves in that scene. Okay, one last Hopper, a print. He has a major career as a printmaker. This one is Evening Wind, and this is a very intimate image. Here we have a single woman. And by the way, one of the themes that's beginning to repeat over and over here is that theme of the working woman. Women out of the home, having jobs in the office place, and living in the city in apartments by themselves or with girlfriend roommates. This is a whole theme, and the subtext to that in American culture is that these young women are vulnerable. They're young, they're desirous, and they're at the age where they themselves desire. And so there's this kind of latent sexuality implied through all these themes. And this is a nice case in point, where this young woman on what must be a very hot night in the city is climbing naked into bed. Her window is open. You assume she's on an upper story. But suddenly a wind comes up and billows the draperies out. She turns her head, maybe startled, gets a view out the window. This, of course, would also give a view of her to someone who is in the high-rise building opposite her. And so you have this sense of interior-exterior as being very much about vulnerability, but also about desire and longing, about loneliness, and about sexuality. So complexity is happening now in the American scene. So here we see another kind of Ashcan era Davis, this time a drawing that was accepted to be the cover for the Masses journal. And I'm hoping you'll remember the Masses as one of those small magazines that came from kind of socialist leftist politics in the day. John Sloan worked for that. He did his Ludlow Massacre images for that. And so Davis is part of this kind of more radical social strata that's interested in social justice. And here he does a kind of humorous, a little bit ironic cover for that magazine. I'm letting you look for a moment at this, also a Davis, because it's very different than the first two images we saw. And I need to explain to you the leap here. As I said, Davis started out in Hinrise School of Ashcan Realism, but while he was in school, 1913 came around, and 1913 brought that Armory show where Americans were exposed to European modernism. And Davis went nuts over that. His encounter with Van Gogh and Gauguin and Matisse and Picasso, and all those different forms of European expressiveness and abstraction, completely blew his mind. He fell instantly in love with it, although he knew he didn't understand it yet. He says in his autobiography, as he walked out of the Armory show, he announced to himself that from here on, the abstract kick was on. He wants to figure out how abstraction is done. Now, if you read his journals, and by the way, he left 30,000 pages of handwritten journals full of sketches, all of which, by the way, I've read from beginning to end because he was part of my doctoral dissertation. Went to Harvard and on a grant and read them all one summer. And if you read them, it is the record of a man's mind coming to terms with art and his culture. Really, really brilliant stuff, very lively stuff. And one of the things that you can track in reading them is his long grappling with what abstraction is about and how you might get there. So let's follow that journey a little bit. And I want to go now to this work, Odal, from the 1920s, which is a really weird hybrid of realism and abstraction. The realism is that product there, Odal, the bottle. It purifies. It's a cleansing material that from the 1920s. And he presents it kind of straight up. He's enjoying the graphic design, the font on that. In fact, so much so that later in the 60s, pop artists like Andy Warhol will look back to Davis and say, oh, he was pre-pop. And that's important for Davis, actually, because he understood that America was a populist culture, and he wants to capture and keep that sense of street and life and populist. But he also wants it to be sophisticated and smart and abstract. So here he merges that kind of realistically rendered Odal bottle with these odd kind of geometric abstraction, pseudo-cubist kinds of forms, and is beginning to search for a kind of hybrid that will satisfy his curiosity. So from there we might move to a work like this, Egg Beater number 3, which is a pretty radically abstracted work. He's been thinking a lot about cubism and fauvism and all that and how it works. He decided that to get there, to make that transition, he needed to do a deep experiment. And so he took a rubber glove, an egg beater, and a fan. He nailed them to a board as a still life motif, and he painted and drew that, nothing but that, for almost a year. And in that process, he got so familiar with the forms that he was able to become fluid and let them distill down to be more abstract kinds of forms. Now, if you read his journals during those times, you find him coming to a lot of understanding about different things. So here's a few of those elements. One is he realized that what realism does is depict objects that are static in space. And he realized that that's not actually how reality is. That objects exist in space, but also in time, that none of that is static, and they also exist only from the angle of our perception. And so he gets interested in how an artist might imply a kind of a time-space object perception matrix. And that leads him to start abstracting and synthesizing forms more. He also thinks a lot about color and decides that color is a real thing. It has agency. And we perceive color within the terms of space and time. So he comes up with what he calls his color space formula, where a color block can exist in perspective in space, and that combines with elements of those objects. Point being, he's beginning to think more abstractly, and one of the things he gets interested in that he says about Cubism, he says realism is about our perception, Cubism is about our conception. Conception being an intellectual, abstract construction of things, perception being a sensory experience of things. And he realizes that Cubism is seeking to blend those and present kind of a total reality of those things. And that grabs him very, very powerfully. Now, after that year-long experiment, he goes back to painting all kinds of things, but we can see the fruit of his careful thinking happening. So here, for example, a windshield mirror. It's a genius kind of work, I think. He's very interested in this sort of general abstract structure, and you look at it and it feels quite cubist and so on. But he's also very interested in grounding us in experience of actual daily street life. So what you're actually looking at here relates to an automobile. This, Davis says, is part of the vantage point in modern society through which we see the world, and that interests him. And if you think about it, he's right. I mean, we tend to say we're driving through town in a car. You're looking out the front windshield. You're looking out the side windows. You're looking in the rearview mirror. Right there are three different angles of perception. One of them you're seeing ahead of you. In the mirror, you're seeing what's behind you. In the side windows, you're seeing what's to each side of you. You're actually, in your brain, averaging 4 different viewing points of your place in time and space as you drive through the city. Davis said, that's interesting. How do I get that into a canvas? And he begins to do so here in Windshield Mirror. So if you look at this, you see the total white rectangle of the painting. On the left, you see that black line and 2 right angles that starts to form a rectangle of the image. On the right, you see that those have curved corners. And down the middle, there's a bit of a diagonal line that divides the left and the right half. What you're looking at here is from the inside of a car outward. So on the left, you're looking out the front windshield of the car. And there you can see parts of the window frame, parts of the temperature gauge that's on the front hood of those. That's that little red line there, and those circles. Those 2 black circles is the cowl light on the car. That curved line might be a windshield wiper, not sure. Whereas on the right half of the painting, you're seeing in the rear view mirror. So you're getting 2 views simultaneously. And the idea of simultaneous reality, simultaneous perceptions being averaged in our brain as a conception, those 2 things are unified here into a single image. Really intelligent. I mean, what he's painting is our experience of the modern world more than objects of the modern world. Now, let's let him take that up in a more complex way in this painting, House and Street. This is from 1930. Here he gives us a full-on color portrayal of that modern experience. If you look at the outer framing of the painting, you see 3 red border lines and 1 blue border line. This creates a contained rectangle. Within that, you see a black framing. On the left, it's square. On the right, it's trapezoidal. So on the left, the square, you're actually looking out the front windshield of a car. On the right, at the trapezoid, you're looking at the door window of the car out of your peripheral vision. Hence, it's trapezoidal. So 2 perspectives combined into 1 total painting. Now, this car is moving through the street in time, and so you get little collage glimpses of things from the street. And these Davis has simplified into flat abstract patterns that nonetheless still depict the buildings, the signage, the fire escape ladders, and so on, all at once. And part of that scene is even typography, advertising. You see the word Smith and the little Bell telephone symbol there, and so on. So he's combining all that experience into this one single image, giving you a simultaneity. Now, some people have said that Davis is the most successful inventor of an American cubism, which is an idea I like very much. I don't think any of these guys hardly understood French cubism. That's coming from a whole different training in mathematics and so on. The Americans are more empirical and pragmatic, and a lot of their cubism is clunky. But Davis is really, I think, really smart. Okay, one last Davis to wrap this up. This is a wild painting. Hot Stillscape for 6 Colors, 7th Avenue style. The title is really helpful because it references multiple things that are going on in the making of this painting. So one is the word hot. These are hot colors with a few cools thrown in. Hot, however, also references jazz. Davis was a great fan of jazz, and in fact, he personally knew most of the jazz musicians. Because I did my research on him for my dissertation, I was allowed by his son to go through all the papers in his studio in New York City, which still existed. And on the day calendar, he would make notes, like he might say, Duke Ellington came by today and played a bit of music while I painted. This guy was really in touch with that. He was also friends with Romare Bearden that we looked at earlier, and was very interested in Bearden's interest in jazz and visual art combining. In his journal, he said, what Bearden taught me was, when you hear jazz, don't just listen to the notes. You have to listen to the space between the notes. And the same thing's true in painting. Don't just look at the objects or the colors. You have to figure out what's between them. Hot Stillscape. So stillscape, of course, references both still life and landscape or cityscape. So this is a hot cityscape, landscape, jazzy scene. Now, jazz is composed for keys, like A minor or G major. This painting is composed for a color key, 6 colors. It came from a location, 7th Avenue, but there's also a 7th Avenue style of jazz in the clubs there that Davis appreciated. So he's pulling from all kinds of things. Now, if you actually read his journals, you can find many of the motifs in here and track them to their original source in nature. So they're drawn from nature, but they're highly stylized, abstracted, and then combined in what is a syncopated, rhythmic, improvisational, musical jazz. So Davis is lively, and I love how he brings together so much of what we've been talking about for a while now. All right, see you next time.